Hello, my fellow engineers. We're back with episode 3 of how to build a scalable Python app. Firstly, there's been some great support for the channel recently. I received a lovely message from a fellow Alex, so I thought I'd just give a small shout out. I'm glad these videos are of some help. In the last video, we created a Postgres database that this application will be interacting with. If you haven't created that, then go back to that episode. I'll link it in the description below. So here's today's ticket. Like I've said previously, we should take some time to go through these tickets and really understand what is being asked. So let's go through. When we build an application, then we need an application setup to interact with our database, so that we can interact with our database via an API. So for the acceptance criteria, firstly, we'll create a Pip file that will contain the dependencies for the application. We'll create a setup.py file. We'll create a directory for the clothes shop codebase. We'll create a directory for the test suite. And then finally, we'll create the Python file with the application setup. Remember, for this project, we're using version control. So we'll need to create a new branch for this ticket. I'm going to do a fresh pull from master and then create a branch called ticket-3. So if you want to check what branch you're currently on, you can do a git status. And that'll show us that we're on branch ticket 2, which is from the last episode. So what we'll want to do is check out to main. Now I'm going to do a fresh pull from this main branch. And as you can see, our changes from the previous episode are here. Now I'm going to create a new branch called ticket-3. So I'll do git checkout -b for new branch, and then this one will be called ticket-3. Boom. Now that we have our branch, I'm going to open my IDE. I'm using PyCharm, but feel free to use whatever you want. Now I'm going to create a pip file. This is going to be on the same level as our project main code base. And so I'll add that to Git. The pip file is where we're going to store our dependencies. It's written in YAML, and pipenv will use this to build our virtual environment. I will link the documentation for pipenv in the description if you want to learn more about that. I also have a Medium article in the description that goes through today's episode and also the next one, so feel free to check that out too. In here we're going to have the following. So we'll have our source, which will be using the cheese shop, and we'll need the name, and we'll need the URL where we're going to download it from. I've just copied and pasted this. And we'll verify the SSL as well. Next we're going to add our dev packages. And in here, we're going to use PyTest for our tests. And star just means it will get the latest version. And then we're going to also have PyTest_mock for our fixtures that we'll be using in our test. And now we'll add our project dependencies. So our packages here. So we're using Flask and Flask-SQLAlchemy as well. And this is for our application. And we'll be using PG8000, which is a pure Python Postgres interface. Interestingly, it's called PG8000 because it's believed to be the 8000th interface for Postgres. Now, unfortunately, PG8000 is not fully supported by Sql Alchemy until 1.4, so we'll have to pin this to 1.16.5. In pipenv, if you want to pin a dependency, you have to do == similar to requirements, and then we'll say 1.16.5. Then we'll install requests, which we'll be later using for our HTTP requests, and Sql Alchemy for creating our object relational mapping. So SQL. Now, one final thing we need to add is our clothes shop module, so that we can access all of the code that's within that package itself. And finally, at the bottom here, we can actually set what our project requires in terms of the Python version. And we're using 3.9. Now let's create our setup.py file. This will also be on the same level as our project code base. So let's check that in here. Yes, I'll add that to Git. So in here, we'll create our setup. This is common practice for setting up a Python package. Firstly, we'll start by importing setup. So from setup tools, import setup. Then we'll open our README to add to our package description later. We do that with the following. So with open, and we add our file, which is readme.md. We'll add our encoding, and that's UTF-8, UTF-8. And then we set it as readme_file, and then we'll set the readme as a variable, and we'll read everything from that. And that's it. And now we can create our setup. So we do that by adding setup. And we'll start with the project name. So for us, this is clothes_shop. Then we'll add a short description, which is, so our description is project for YouTube. So actually say clothes shop project. Then we'll add the author. So just put yourself, Alex V. Then we'll add the author email. So my email is alex.engineering. And then we'll add the long description here. And this is where we'll add our README. We'll set that as README, I've missed a comma there. And then finally, we'll add our test suite, which is just the path to where our test suite will be. So clothes_shop/test. And that's it. Now we'll add our clothes shop directory where the code base will sit. And then within this, we'll add our test suite. Now that we have all that set up, let's get everything installed and create our virtual environment using pipenv. So firstly, let's just have a quick look at what's inside our project. So as you can see, we've got our pip file, we have our setup.py, we have our clothes shop, and within that, that'll have the test suite. So let's go ahead and install that. And the way to do it is just doing pipenv install, and then we'll put -d to install the development packages. Okay, seems that we don't have a Sql Alchemy. Yeah, that's not correct. So don't worry, this stuff happens. This is part of software engineering. You don't always get everything right first time. So let's go back to the pip file, correct our mistake. Let's clear some space here, and we'll run the same command again, pipenv install -d to get that all installed. Okay, great. So now that's all installed, let's just have a quick look at what's inside the directory. So let's do an ls. And so now you can see there's this pip file.lock that's been created, and that's locked our dependencies for this project. Now we want to create our application setup. So let's go inside our clothes shop and let's create a new Python file called application setup. And yes, we'll add that to Git. In our application setup, we essentially want to set up our configuration that will allow our application to interact with our database. Flask-SQLAlchemy plugin sets this up for us. We'll be using the Sql Alchemy database URI, Sql Alchemy Binds, which can also be used for multiple database connections. And then we'll also turn the track modifications off. This will save us on memory, and we can refresh objects manually when we need to. I'll also link this documentation in the description below if you want to have a look. So let's start our application setup. So we'll just set .string at the top here. Firstly, we'll import OS because we're going to be using some environment variables for our username, password, and I think database name. We'll import Flask. So and we'll import Sql Alchemy from the Flask Sql Alchemy plugins. So now we can create our application setup function. So first let's define it. Setup. So here we'll create a Flask application and initialize the clothes shop database. Now we'll set our username, and we'll get this from the environment variable. And the environment variable will be called Postgres username. And in fact, we need to do .get. And what we'll do is we'll set this as a default. For me, the username is Alex. And then we'll get our password. So again, we can just copy and paste this. And here we'll have Postgres password. And we'll again set a default here. This is just for testing purposes. In the next episode, we're actually going to go through how you set up a password for your database. So don't worry about that for now. And then finally, we're going to add our database names. And we're going to do the same thing. And then here we'll just call this database name. And again, for this default, we're going to call this clothes shop as a default. Now we can set up our app. So we're just going to do _app equals Flask, and we'll initialize that. And then we're going to use Python special variable name here, which will take either the main program where you're running it from, or if it's been imported, it will take the script name that you've imported it. Don't worry about that for now, it's not hugely important. And now we'll add our configuration. So do _app.config, and we're going to set up the Sql Alchemy database URI first. I've just copied and pasted that from the documentation. And in here, I'm going to create an F string because we're going to be using a URI that will contain the username, the password, and the database name. So firstly, we'll add our database drivers. We're using Postgres, so Postgres SQL, and then we're using PG8000 to drive the interface. Then we'll add our username and password, ://, and then because I'm using an F string, I can put the username, and then we have a colon, put the curly brackets again to get the variable to be inserted, and this will be password. Okay. Then we need to set the host and port that Postgres listens on, so that is localhost, and the default for Postgres is 5432. And then finally we add our database name at the end, so / curly braces, and we'll add the database name there, and that's our URI. And now we'll add the Sql Alchemy binds. So again, _app.config, and then we'll add Sql Alchemy binds. And this is a dictionary that binds the database name to the SQL database URI. Paste that into there. Finally, we're just going to set the track modifications to false. So config, and this is false. Now we want to set up our database, and we will do that by instantiating the Sql Alchemy, and we're going to pass it our application. And then we want to initialize the database with the application so that we can have an interface then between the application and the database to be used later. And then we just want to return the database, so the application first, and then the database. And that's it. Now, as always, let's go through our definition of done before we commit our changes to GitHub. So the acceptance criteria was that we create a pip file that will contain the dependencies for the application. That's been done. We created a setup.py file, so that's done. We created a directory for our closed shop code base and the directory within that for the test suite, so that's been done. And then finally, we created our application setup. So we've ticked off all the acceptance criteria off the list. Now we can push our changes to GitHub. So let's just look at the changes that we've made. So we can do a git status to see all of those. So we've got our pip file, we've got our application setup, and we have our setup.py. We also need to add in our pipfile.lock. So if we want to add that, we can do a git add, and then we'll add the pipfile.lock. And then if we let's clear some space, we'll do another git status, and we can see it's been added there. So now we're just going to do a git add -u to update everything. So now we can do another git status. So clear the space again. So git status, and we can see everything is now up to date, ready to be committed. So now let's do that. Git commit -m for a message, and we'll say adding application setup to project. Okay, and then we'll just do a git push. Remember that we need to set the upstream because it's the first time we push to this branch. And there we go. Now if we go to our repository, we can compare and do a pull request. Here we add our changes. So here we can write when we want an application, then we need a setup to interact with our database so that we can access data about our flows. And the changes we made here were adding the pip file, adding the clothes shop code base, and inside of here we added our application setup, and we also added in our test suite directory. And that's it. So now we can create our pull request. We can see that there. And obviously because we are the main code owners, we can just merge that pull request. And then of course delete your branch. And that's it. So now we can see our changes have been added. So that's it for today's episode. In the next one, we'll be adding a password to our database and then testing our application setup. I hope you found this useful. Any questions, feel free to comment below. and I'll catch you on the next one.